Hi, everyone. Erich Prince here, editor-in-chief of Merion West. I'm joined today by author John Cribb, who, among other books, has written Old Abe and The Rail Splitter. So our conversation today is going to be sort of centered around Abraham Lincoln, as well as John's kind of interesting style and approach, something I've talked about before here and in other forums of writers who were nonfiction authors primarily, and then start to experiment a little bit with different narrative techniques. And I think, John, if I'm not mistaken, your books are described as novels.
Right. They're both historical novels. And they both taken together basically walk you through Abraham Lincoln's life from his youth on the frontier through the end of his life. The Rail Splitter, which is just out, starts you off in the summer of 1826 when he's a teenager on the Indiana frontier, and then you basically, are with him as he makes his way from the woods of Indiana to the prairies of Illinois, up through the really to the threshold of the White House, up through the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, and then it ends in late 1859, and Old Abe picks up in spring of 1860 when he's being nominated for the presidency, and then it tells the story of the last 5 years of his life. So taken together, you get pretty much his whole life.
And John, I know in previous interviews and forums, you've spoken about your longstanding admiration for President Lincoln, and obviously tackled other topics in your books prior to turning to Abraham Lincoln. But maybe you can describe sort of the origin of your admiration for Lincoln. And then secondly, were you sort of saving him as a topic for later after you've kind of honed your skills more, or something that you always plan to write? Or was it sort of a product of the times we live in? How did you decide at the point that you did to say, now I'm going to talk about this man I've admired since childhood?
Yeah. Well, in answer to the first question, my interest in Lincoln goes way back when I was a kid, when my mom would read to me and my brother and sister when we were, tiny, even before we could read ourselves. And some of the stuff that she read was about Lincoln, including there's one book I can remember in particular. There was an old series that's still around called the Childhood of Famous Americans biography series. They had orange covers back then. Now they're more colorful covers, but
I've read a
there was
couple.
one. Yeah, they're great. They're great for introducing kids to history. But there was one called Abe Lincoln, Frontier Boy by Augustus Stevenson, and those old stories of him, studying by firelight and chopping down trees to build log cabins and walking through the woods to borrow books. Those frontier stories really grabbed my imagination. So I've been interested in them for a long time. The I'd always wanted to write a novel. I've been writing pretty much my whole career. I was an English major at Vanderbilt University, so I'm kind of a literature guy at heart. But nothing, a topic never really struck me until it was 2006, I think, and I was back living in my hometown, Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I was at the time reading Carl Sandburg's landmark nonfiction multi-volume biography of about Abraham Lincoln. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it, and it was almost that book's almost set is almost 100 years old now. I think it's 6 volumes, beautifully written. One of the really great Lincoln biographies of over the decades. And I was kind of plowing my way through these 6 volumes, and at the same time, I reread a book that I had been assigned to read in an AP European history class when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, and that was Irving Stone's wonderful novel about the life of Michelangelo, The Agony and the Ecstasy.
Yeah.
Came out in the 70s. It's really a wonderful historical novel, and it tells basically the story of Michelangelo's life. And that set me to wondering, could I do this for Lincoln? Has anybody done it for Lincoln? And the answer really turned out to be no, even though there are thousands and thousands of books written about Lincoln. They say more books written about Lincoln than anybody in history except for Jesus Christ, and that's probably true. Um, as far as I could tell, nobody had really novelized, tried to tell the story of his life through the vehicle of historical fiction like this. So that got the wheels turning, and really kind of what was the inspiration for this effort.
So you mentioned that you're a literature major, and we also know that after college, you sort of went in a different direction and entered working in the federal government, in the Department of Justice, the Department of Education. And then at some point, you must have said, okay, I'm going to pursue my passion of sorts of writing books. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like? Because I guess we see it a lot. There are people who are interested in writing or music or whatever, and then sort of reality asserts itself and they have to pursue various more traditional professions. And then in some cases, they at some point say, okay, I'm going to try to return to sort of my initial love, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of what happened with me. Like you said, when I was right out of college, I went to work at the Department of Justice, thinking I wanted to be an attorney,
Mhm.
and had a really interesting 2 years there. I was working for the Reagan administration, but it made me decide, that's not me. I didn't decide not to go to law school, and then I went to work at the Department of Education, writing speeches for Bill Bennett when he was Secretary of Education, and I'd done some little bit of writing.
I think you did a
For
Wall
the
Street Journal piece with him.
Yeah, yeah. Later on, I did. Yeah. Um, and we've Bill and I've collaborated on different projects over the years. Um, but after I worked at education, I kind of got the book writing bug, and left that job to write. My first book was it's not the most exotic title in the world. It was titled "A Field Guide to Interstate 95." How's that for a sexy title for a book? And it was a history of the land that I-95 is laid down on top of, from Maine down to Florida. So it was really a history book, in the guise of a travel guide.
I think that's
So
fascinating. I obviously am on I-95 regularly.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
sometimes better experiences than others.
right, yeah,
Um, yeah, that's a really interesting concept. And I know there are a few people who have done sort of kind of the stories of what things were like before uh,
yeah,
we have sort of this modern thing place there. So that's actually really interesting, John. I didn't know that.
yeah, yeah. And it was the research was just a lot of fun. So anyway, that was my kind of my first book endeavor, and then I've just done different things over the years, and managed to make a living doing that. Um, sometimes my own stuff, sometimes helping other people with books, and I helped um, online a company that was launching an online school, uh, devise their history curriculum, stuff like that. Um, but all nonfiction until these books came along, and I've loved doing the nonfiction, but I have to say these two are my favorite projects that I've ever worked on. These two historical novels, I think, because it blends both worlds, the world of nonfiction, which is very fact oriented, with the world of the creativity that's connected with fiction and novels. So to me, anyways, it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Because as you said, you studied literature at Vanderbilt. You didn't study journalism. So
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
it's as though
I,
that type of narrative form might be conducive to where you were initially confined.
yes, that's right. I was a literature major, and a lot of history
Mhm.
too. I took a lot of history courses. So again, this is kind of this kind of project is kind of a right in my wheelhouse, I think, and I really have enjoyed doing it.
So you mentioned William Bennett, and as I alluded to, kind of in preparation for this discussion, I did some reading, and one of the pieces that I read was an article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal with him, and you begin by talking about this famous remarks President Lincoln gives about no political idea I had came from anywhere other than the Declaration of Independence, and in George Will's book, The Conservative Sensibility, this is an idea he talks about a lot. And maybe you can, starting to jump into Lincoln's life a little bit, maybe we should start there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, as probably most of your audience knows, he was born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, and spends the first almost 8 years of his life in Kentucky. And then his family moves across the Ohio River into southern Indiana. They literally hack their way into the wilderness and to a little, plot of land that they're claiming, they're purchasing, and it's just way out there on the frontier. I mean, really in the middle of nowhere. When they first get there, they build a little three-sided. They called it a pole shed, just a lean-to to kind of huddle in the first few weeks until they can make it, make it to good weather to build a proper log cabin. And this is where he does most of his growing up in southern Indiana. And this is where The Rail Splitter, my novel, starts out with him as a teenager on the Indiana frontier. And then when he's about 21 years old, his family moves again to Illinois, and he goes with them to help them get started, and then he kind of cuts off on his own to forge his own path, and lives the rest of his life in Illinois until he's elected and goes off to the White House. And that's really the story of the Rail Splitters, that story of that remarkable journey he makes from that log cabin to the White House. And it really is, in a lot of ways, Erich, it's in a lot of ways it's the American story of the American dream. It's a remarkable story, not in the way that I wrote it, but it's just an incredible life story, that journey from a log cabin to the White House. It's inspired generations of Americans, and one reason I wrote the book is I don't want us to lose that inspiration of that story, that journey.
And I think obviously there are identifiable things about many individuals' journeys, many politicians' journeys, maybe this sort of idea of at the end of anyone's life, it could be a novel. But I think one of the things that brings Lincoln into focus is how well documented some of his sort of shortcomings and things not really working out are. And he's a guy who, sort of like all of us, had a couple things go sideways and not work out as was expected. But as you've talked about in the past, you've always admired his sense of perseverance.
Yeah.
I think that's a theme that you've indicated is really important to you when you look at Lincoln's life. Right.
It really is. If you ask me what is the one, trait or virtue I admire most about him, it probably is his perseverance. And he really did. It's not like his life was, exclusively one setback after the other until he's elected president. He had ups and downs just like everybody else. But starting from early age, I mean, his mother dies when he's not quite 10 years old, out there on the frontier. And so that's just kind of the first of many deaths that he knows in his life. He meets setbacks in the world of work. When he's a young man in Illinois, he starts a general store with a partner, and a little log cabin general store, and it goes sideways pretty fast. They weren't very good businessmen. It winks out, as he puts it. And he goes into debt, just knowing creditors for things like inventory and rent, and it's a huge amount of money for I think it's about $1,000, but it was a huge amount of money for a young man of limited means on the frontier back then. So he has to pay that off. He instead of running away from it, he says, "I'm going to pay this off." It takes several years and jobs to do it, but he does. He's constantly underestimated as an attorney. People, take one look at him and think this guy's a rube from the prairies, and they underestimate him. So he does, and of course he loses. First time he runs for office, political office, in 1832, he runs for the state legislature. He loses, but he comes back. Tries again 2 years later and wins. So it's a remarkable life of perseverance. One of his earliest memories was when he was in Kentucky. So he would have been probably around 7 years old, and he wrote about this in one of the few kind of instances where he writes down a memory like this. But he wrote how he had helped his father plant a field, a big field. They lived on a farm called Knob Creek at the time, and they planted it with pumpkin seed and corn seed. And it took them a while. They got it all planted, and a couple of days later, it rained really hard, and the rain came rolling down the hills around the field, and the creek floods, and it washed everything away. All their hard work is washed away. And we can, in our imaginations, we can just imagine him standing at the edge of the field with the next day with his dad, and his dad looking down at him and saying, "Hey, we're going to plant it again." And that's what they did. They just had to keep going. You had to persevere if you were going to make it on the frontier. And that's what he does when he gets to Washington. Part of his greatness is just his perseverance, because as the Civil War goes badly for the North, there were plenty of times when a lot of people in the North said, "This isn't worth it. Just stop. Let the South go. Let them have their own country. Let them have their slaves. Just stop." And Lincoln said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to see this through. We're going to hold this union together." He used to tell people, he said, when he was president, he said, "I'm like a man trying to keep a tent up in a storm." And he said, "I get it all staked
Great
down to the
analogy.
ground." I'm sorry?
That's a great analogy.
Yes. Yeah, it was. And he said, "I get it staked down to the ground with all the tent stakes. And as soon as I do, the wind comes along and it blows out one of the tent stakes. And I grab a hammer and I peg it back down to the ground. And as soon as I get it in, the wind blows out another tent stake. So I run around, I peg it back down. And as soon as I get it in, the wind blows another stake, and I run around, I peg it back down." And he told people, "That's all I do all day long, is I keep pegging away, pegging away." And that's basically what he did as president. He pegged away through 4 awful, horrible years as president.
So obviously, none of us were in President Lincoln's head, but you have more than most engaged with the scholarship, with the primary sources, with the literature. As best as you can see it, how do you what do you sort of identify as maybe the source of his perseverance?
I think it basically was growing up on the frontier and having to persevere. Out on the frontier where he grew up, if you didn't persevere, you weren't going to make it, and you probably weren't going to survive. So I think he learned that early on, just from that frontier spirit that we've all read about and learned about, and we studied that part of the country in that times.
It's almost a matter of habit. He would develop the habit
Exactly.
of doing that.
Yeah, and that of course is really how we form many of our virtues and vices that we have in our characters, is habit. That's how, as Aristotle pointed out long ago, it's habit. And so he did develop this basket of virtues, like perseverance and a willingness to work hard and an eagerness to learn. He had less than a year of schooling his entire life, but developed just this burning willingness and desire to learn, which is one reason he was such a great president. When he gets to the White House, he's brilliant at learning on the job at that point, because he's done it his entire life. And other virtues like integrity and compassion, and that he again he's just built up over his life from growing up on the frontier, and his experiences as he makes his way to the White House. So by the time he is elected, he really has. I think that one of the interesting things about the story in the Rail Splitter, to me, is that you watch this, or you really walk with this him as he starts out life as a very driven. He's always very driven, but in a lot of ways very callow and directionless, young person, as many of us are. He later on in life, he called himself a piece of floating driftwood.
The
He
same
referred
is
to himself.
sometimes often said of James Madison as a young person, until he
Yes,
sort of got into
yes,
the cause of
right.
evolution, and he wasn't, well, the precursor to it, and wasn't exactly sure of which way to go as he came back from Princeton. And then finally, he had
Right.
all these immense talents, but it wasn't necessarily clear what the reservoir for them would be.
And that's the same with Lincoln. And he in one way, it's a really great story for young people, because he starts off thinking he wants to be a river man. I mean, he's fascinated with steamboats, and he thinks maybe he'd like to get a job as a roustabout, just on the decks, and then maybe work his way up to pilot or captain. And then he tries his hand of all kinds of things. He's a clerk in a general store. As I said, he owns his own general store. He's a surveyor. He's a postmaster. He does everything from slaughtering hogs to tending stills. I mean, he really tries everything. And then he decides that he wants to be a lawyer, and he there's no law school for him to go to, so he gets hold of a law book, the Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, and he just studies until he teaches himself enough law to be admitted to the bar. But he he starts off in life as we all do, I guess, asking himself questions like, what am I going to do with my life? How am I going to get off the farm? Where am I going to live? How am I going to get a girl? And which are important questions, but are largely about the self. And it's fascinating to watch, to see him grow and gradually come to attach himself to something much larger than his own self. And that is the cause of course, of country and freedom and equality. And that's when he becomes the great statesman that we know him as, I think.
Because I think that's really a crucial point, and sort of as cliched as it is for me to say it, I think sometimes we do have a tendency to look back on certain historical figures and have a sense of, it was going to be, they were always kind of moving in this direction. But as you point out, these ambiguities and such affect these can affect at least these great men just as much. And what am I going to do? And I'm going to be the litany of professions you described in just Abraham Lincoln's early life is really really interesting, I think, to think about.
Yeah, it really is. As I say, he's a great study and inspiration for, I think, young people who are starting out, not sure which direction that they want to. It's kind of comforting to know that Lincoln and others, I mean, so many others in history, they don't know exactly what they want to do when they start out either. And of course, Lincoln came along at a time when all of a sudden, for centuries, people were pretty much, they were in agriculture, most of them.
Right.
And but he came along at a time when the Industrial Revolution was just beginning to reach, that part of the world, and there was, the middle class was just coming into being, and there were, he saw that, he realized that. His dad did not. His father thought, he was being just kind of a wooden-headed idiot for not being a farmer, because he was a big, strong, tall, strapping guy, and he just thought he should be a farmer. And Lincoln did not want to be a farmer at all. And he's determined to make something of himself in one way or the other. And so, as I say, he was very driven, and that was a big part of his character too.
So you just mentioned that Lincoln, like a lot of people, has the thought of, how am I going to get a girl? So maybe you could talk a little about Abraham Lincoln's romantic life.
Yeah, and this is part of a story in the Rail Splitter. His his first love, I think, was a young lady named Anne Rutledge, who he meets in a tiny little frontier village called New Salem, Illinois, out on the frontier, about 20 miles west of Springfield. And when he gets there, it's a village of, and he gets there, the first time he gets there is in 1831. And there are about 100 people living there, which, by the way, was the same size as Chicago in 1831. Chicago had about 100 people living there. So this is really early on in the history of that part of the country. And she's kind of the village beauty, and she's got a fiance actually when he gets there, but he ends up winning her hand. And I don't want to give too much away for anybody who might read the book, but that ends kind of tragically, I guess you'd say. And then he later on, he after about 6 years of living in New Salem, he moves to Springfield in 1837, and this is where he meets Mary Todd, and this is an important part of the story of the Rail Splitter too. And Mary's from a very different background from Abraham Lincoln. She was born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a refined town for that part of the country. It was known as the Athens of the South. She was from a very well-to-do family. Her dad was a prosperous businessman and banker. He was a slaveholder. She grew up with servants in the house. She went to fine private schools. She knew how to speak French. So it's a very different background, but they are attracted to each other for a variety of reasons. Partly they share a love of politics. And she sees something special in this guy. She realizes that even though he's still pretty raw boned, that he's going places. She used to tell people when they're courting, she said he's going to be president someday. I think she believed it long before he
Nice
did.
when people have confidence in you, John, isn't it?
Yeah, Isn't it? Isn't it?
That's
Yeah.
really what is a very can be a very nice thing.
Yeah. And so a big part of the story of both the Rail Splitter and the Old Abe is the story of Mary and Abraham Lincoln and their courtship and their marriage. And I'm sure as many of your audience knows that it was in some ways a rocky marriage, and Mary, like us all, was a
You
flawed person, and she.
you and others have used the adjective tempestuous.
Yes, yeah, it was a tempestuous marriage, and she had a temper, and he was moody, and so you see some of that in the books, of course, and then the war comes, and she really is not emotionally equipped to deal with it, and they lose. I think a big part of it is they lose two sons. The second one, Willie, they lose in the White House in the middle of this tragedy. I you know I neither of them knew what they were getting into when he was elected. It was just a river of fire and blood that kept coming and coming and coming and would not let up. And he had it's a weird word to use, I guess, but the luxury of having, he was president, he had that job, he had to prosecute that war, he had to focus on it. She didn't have that, and she gradually declines her, emotionally and psychologically, she begins to fall apart. And part of the story of old Abe is his trying to do whatever he can to try to hold her together while this awful war is going on.
We know that presidents losing a child at that time can be a major issue. Franklin Pierce and other presidents, that can be a very significant event for sure.
Yeah, and it really, I think, crushed both of them. And she, that's really, I think, after they lose Willie in February of 1862, that's really when you start to see her go downhill, and she turns to spiritualism and just was grasping at just about any straw. And I think it's horrifying for Abraham Lincoln to see his wife slipping away and not knowing what to do, and having to be president while this is happening.
If I recall correctly, despite Pierce's very significant differences with Lincoln on a number of issues, he did write him a very heartfelt letter upon the death of his son, kind of being able to very much empathize with that. So you used a word a second ago, moody, and I know that in sort of recent scholarship, whether it's the book A First Rate Madness or others, various authors have tried to make much of Lincoln's sort of mental states throughout his life. And I'm wondering sort of if you have an opinion on that. Are some authors and commentators overplaying that? Do you think that's fair? There's obviously been a lot of interest in that aspect of his psyche.
Yeah, I think, yeah, he definitely had these two sides of his being, his psyche. There was the famous melancholy side, which a lot of people noted. His law partner of many years, Billy Herndon, said that he dripped melancholy when he walked. And of course he had that kind of sad looking face that
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? Right?
yeah, and then on the other hand, he has this laughing, jovial, joking side of him. People said that I mean, could be very funny. People said that he could make a cat laugh. He was so funny, and that if you walked into a room, there's a knot of people standing around laughing. If you looked in the middle, Lincoln was probably in there, telling one of his jokes or stories. So there was that side to him. I don't think he was. I think there were two times in his life when I think you could probably say he was what we would describe as clinically depressed. When this got hold of him so badly, he was just non-functioning.
Right.
And you see both of those times in the Rail Splitter. One, and they both have to do with women, interestingly.
Right.
It's after he loses Anne Rutledge, and then at a rocky period of his courtship with Mary Todd, when he really just falls apart, and his friends are worried about him to the point of wondering, is he gonna do himself in? As a matter of fact, when he was living in Springfield and he was going through this period, his friends made sure that they took all the knives and razors out of the room, that kind of thing. But I think after that, he learns to control it. And even though he always has this melancholy side for the rest of his life, where he can just suddenly kind of slip into a gloom and want to be off kind of brooding. He doesn't, I think, go into a tailspin like that because he's a highly functioning president. I mean, he arguably the best president we ever had, and so he's in there doing his job, and but he's always got that melancholy side, and he dealt with it in different ways. He deliberately cultivated humor to help drive away the blues, as he sometimes called them. He would sometimes start out cabinet meetings reading from joke books and humorists that he liked, and he was doing it, and a couple of his cabinet members objected, and he said, "Gentlemen, if I did not laugh, I would die." And he said, "You need this. You should laugh too. You need this medicine as much as I do." So that's one way he dealt with his melancholy side. And I hope you see that in these two novels as you walk with him, that he's got both of those aspects of his personality.
But I think that's an important point. I know that Harry Truman had remarked that in studying the lives of the great men, sort of the crucial turning point is when they gained a mastery over themselves. And I think that's a really important point of learning how to deal with this. And we know other historical figures, Winston Churchill, found out a way to deal with his melancholy and found sort of bricklaying at his estate and kind of getting out and doing things physically was very helpful. And I guess different, I don't think it's a coincidence that David McCullough begins Mornings on Horseback by quoting Theodore Roosevelt saying that black care rarely sits long behind the rider whose pace is fast enough. And it seems as though a lot of these figures found out a way to not necessarily dispense with their demons, but to at least quell them to the point that they're able to be functional and functional in a significant way.
I think that's exactly right. And that's what Lincoln does. And I think he does it by cultivating humor, deliberately seeking out laughter, and I think he does it through work, throwing himself into work especially when he's president, but really his whole life. And then I think in the White House part of his years, not so much before the White House, but faith becomes a part of it. He becomes, as the war goes on and gets worse and worse, he becomes a more spiritual person, and he does try to make time to read the Bible, every day. And so I think, and searching for answers, and so I think that plays a part in it as well.
And I think some readers and people engaging with Lincoln's life, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Lincoln had the most necessarily conventional relationship with religion. I don't think he was kind of immersed in a church, and I think he more kind of had more of a personal relationship with religion rather than sort of part of a faith community, as we might call it, or something like that.
Right, that's exactly right. He, on the one hand, he probably knew the Bible as well as any president we've ever had. He quoted it all the time, and as I say, when he was in the White House, tried to read it every day. On the other hand, he was never baptized, and he never joined a church his entire life. There was a discomfort there with organized religion. He did go to church, both before the White House years, not every Sunday by any means, but he liked going to church. He was friends with the minister of First Presbyterian in Springfield, James Smith. Liked talking with him. And then when they were in Washington, they went to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and Phineas Gurley, the rector minister there, he was friends with. And sometimes he went on Wednesdays. But there was I think part of it was just the dogma of the churches of those days. He reportedly told more than one person, he said, if you can ever find for me a church where the only requirement for membership is the great commandment, you should love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind, love your fellow neighbor as yourself. He said, that's the church I'll join. You never find that church.
Come on, John. I love that.
Yeah. So, but on the other hand, he does, because as you say, it's a personal religion in a way, I guess. And he comes to see, as the war goes on, God taking a direct hand in human affairs and the Civil War. And if you read the second inaugural address, it's an astounding speech, and it's very short. I think it's the shortest of all inaugural addresses, but it's maybe it's the most spiritual of all. The Lincoln scholar Ronald White I think, wrote that he mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times, all in this very 700 word speech. And he gives his view that the Civil War was God's way of punishing both North and South for the sin of slavery, and that all this awful bloodshed, in effect, is God's way of wiping, cleansing the land of that sin. So it's a very spiritual view of the war that he comes to take.
John, there's so many things I want to ask you because as you tell me more and more about Lincoln, there are just more thoughts that are occurring to me, and I do want to circle back. And this because you're talking about the second inaugural, and I had previously mentioned about the remarks about Declaration of Independence being sort of the source from which his political philosophy flowed. We all know the Gettysburg Address, and maybe comparison is the thief of joy, and we shouldn't even begin to choose among his various speeches and writings and orations with Stephen Douglas, as you mentioned. But can you, for people, let's say we all have limited time, for people who are listening who want to maybe they already know the Gettysburg Address and they want to, and you mentioned the brevity of the second inaugural. What are a couple places in Lincoln's own words they can look to and say, I'm getting an insight into the mind and political philosophy of the 16th president?
From the book, you mean from one of these books?
Yeah,
I Yeah, I will if we have just a second, if we have time enough for
I
it.
would love it.
Okay, I will read one page from Old Abe, and to give your people a flavor of it, and then let me read just a couple of very brief paragraphs from the sources that I use. Is that all right?
This one here, Old Abe.
Yes. So this takes place early in the book when Lincoln has been elected. Lives in Springfield, Illinois, and one of the last things he does is he goes out to tell his stepmother, Sally Lincoln, goodbye. After his mother had died when he was just about age 10, his father remarries, and his stepmother becomes a very important figure in his life. And she's now an old lady living out about 80 miles east of Springfield in Coles County, Illinois. So he takes a series of trains out to see her to tell her goodbye before he goes off to Washington. So this passage I'm going to read to you comes from the end of that chapter where he's gone out to her place to
Do you
tell
have a
her
page number,
goodbye.
John, so I can follow?
Yeah, I'm reading from page 58,
Great.
and starting about 3 or 4 paragraphs down. He had not expected to feel so bad about leaving her. They had seen so little of each other during the last several years. Perhaps he should have made more of an effort. When you're in Washington, think of me in my old log farmhouse, she said. I will, I will. For a few seconds, neither said anything. She studied his bearded face, searching perhaps for that raw-boned youth with an axe in one hand and a book in the other. She fought to hold back tears. You never gave me a cross word or look, she said softly. Scarcely one mother in 1,000 can say that. You're the best boy I ever saw or ever expect to see. She clung to him, unwilling for him to go just yet. They say there's going to be a war. Is that true? I don't know. I hope not, but if we have a war, I expect it won't last long. Somehow I thought she would never grow truly old, he thought. She always had more strength than anyone I knew, but the vigor in her blue-gray eyes had faded. I didn't want you to run for president, Abe. I didn't want you to be elected. I'm afraid something will befall you and I'll see you no more. The tears she had been holding came back. They'll kill you, Abe. No, I won't let them do that, he murmured, kissing her forehead. They'll assassinate you, she cried, and I'll never see you again. He pulled her tight, wondering if it really would be for the last time. No, no, Mama, they won't do that. Trust in the Lord and all will be well. We'll see each other again.
That's really beautiful writing, John, and I'm so glad you got to read that so those listening get a sense of your narrative style and sort of the emotional weight with which you're sometimes writing throughout. And I'm so glad we kind of had that opportunity.
Well, thank you. That takes place in early 1861, right before he goes. And if we have time, I'll just tell you
Absolutely.
we know this happens because we have eyewitness accounts. After Lincoln was killed, his law partner, Billy Herndon, devoted several years to interviewing hundreds of people that had known him before he was president, mostly in his Indiana and Illinois days. And two of the people he interviewed, one was Sally Lincoln when she was after he was gone. Of course, she's an old lady. And in that interview, she said, Abe never gave me a cross word or look. He was the best boy I ever saw or ever expect to see. I wish I had died when my husband died. I did not want Abe to run for president, did not want him elected, was afraid somehow or other, felt in my heart that something would happen to him. And when he came down to see me after he was elected president, I still felt that something would befall Abe and that I should see him no more. And then Augusta Chapman, who had married one of Lincoln's cousins, was also there for that meeting. And he told Herndon, he said the parting between him and his mother was very affectionate. She embraced him when they parted and said she would never be permitted to see him again. And she felt that his enemies would assassinate him. He replied, no, Mama. He always called her Mama. They will not do that. Trust in the Lord and all will be well. We will see each other again. So see, I've taken the words from these interviews that they purportedly said to each other from these and other sources and tried to build them directly into the scene. So as much as possible, that's what I've done. I've gone back to the historical record and as far back as I can go and tried to build the words and descriptions right into the novel to try to bring that time back and bring them alive for us.
So I read a lot of history, as a lot of people know, and I think probably most of the people listening and watching and most of the MW audience has that in common. And I won't speak for anyone else, but speaking for myself, I'll be reading and I'll sometimes say, how does the writer know what he knows? Are they and sometimes we have a sense of this, that they're very influenced by a certain secondary source, or they're in the archives going through a primary source. My friend Alan Hornblum, who I've done a couple sit downs with like this, and also is a nonfiction writer who's experimented a little bit with fiction. I know that he is big into he did a big biography on Bill Tilden. He's going to all the tennis clubs where he played and the archives and trying to talk to an archivist here and digging up all the documentation and just sort of what does that process look like for someone like you? And obviously Lincoln's been gone a bit longer, someone like Tilden, but kind of what does that process look like?
Well, for me, the research basically fell into three broad categories. First is just good old-fashioned book reading. I've got somewhere between 250 and 300 just books about Lincoln and his times on my shelves at home.
That you've engaged with this so much, but B, as you said, that so many people have written biographies of Lincoln.
Yeah. And
have a shelf and say, okay, well, I've got 300 here.
That's a fraction of the books about him. A lot of them are old books written and published in the late 19th, early 20th century by people who knew Lincoln and wrote of their firsthand interactions and conversations with him. Those are the most important ones. And then resources like these interviews that Herndon did with people, as far back as I can get in as far as the books. And if you go back to his time, that's the most important. So that's book research, and then some internet research. There's an amazing amount of information about Lincoln on the internet, and a lot of it's, his collected writings are all there, and you can go to the Library of Congress has digital images of all his papers in his handwriting. There are great sites, like there's one called Mr. Lincoln's White House, but it has the floor plans of the White House that existed in Lincoln's time, and you can click on any of the rooms. It'll pull up a picture of the room as it looked back then. It'll tell you stories about things that happened in that room. So a lot of good information on the web. And then the last category was travel. I've been to all the Lincoln sites more than once, from Sinking Spring Farm in Kentucky, where he was born, to Ford's Theater, where he was assassinated, and lots of places in between. That was absolutely crucial.
I bet it was. I think it's important to see the
right. Yeah. You got to walk the ground he walked, and where his world still exists, try to soak up that atmosphere as much as possible. So, for example, that little village of New Salem where he lived as a young man for 6 years is now a state park, and they've reconstructed those log cabins in that village, and you can walk there down, and really get a good sense of who he was and where he came from. And of course his home in Springfield, that kind of thing. And the docents and historians and rangers and volunteers that work in places like that are often, experts in that one slice of Lincoln's life, and their insights are invaluable. So soaking up his world as much as possible was an absolutely crucial part of the research.
And I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't recall off the top of your head, but just for those who are interested, where do you recall where in we could find where Lincoln had said about he'd join a church if they kind of stuck to the love God, love your neighbor?
Well, that was a woman that he knew when he was living in that village of New Salem. I was one of the people that reported that comes from one of the Herndon interviews, I believe, as I recall, where she was talking about he spent a night at her cabin or her house one night, and they stayed up late talking about all the things you stay up late talking about when you stay up late, and on the subject of religion. And he told her, as I recall in that conversation, he said, I feel like I'll always be a seeker, I think is the word he used. That he, at that time in his life, he felt like he wanted to believe, but couldn't quite, Lincoln had a very rational side of his brain. And, he was a lawyer. He used to, when he was out riding from courthouse to courthouse, he would carry Euclidean geometry with him, and he liked to read Euclidean math books. That's how, he had that very, and I think at that time in his life, that rational side of his brain was so strong, he just couldn't make a leap of faith. And so he told her, was one of the people he told about that statement about joining church. Yeah.
Really interesting. So I think the last thing I want to ask you about is sort of how your book is received among other people who are sort of students or acolytes of Lincoln. It's obviously unmistakable, or can't miss it right at the top of Old Abe. Former Vice President Mike Pence says, quote, "The best book on President Lincoln I've ever read." That must have been a nice compliment for you, John.
Yeah, and it came out of the blue. He it was the Monday after the 2020 election, and I was on the phone with somebody else, and this call with a 202 area code kept buzzing me. I kept ignoring it, and then it finally dawned on me from my years in Washington, it was a White House exchange. So I'd answer it, and it was a young lady said, "Can you speak to the vice president?" I said, "Sure." And all of a sudden I was on the phone with Mike Pence, and he said, "John, I'm a huge Lincoln fan." Well, I'd never met him or talked to him, but he said, "I'm a huge Lincoln fan. My college thesis was about him. I'm sitting in the White House. I've got a half a dozen books on my shelf about him, but I just finished Old Abe last night, and I had to track you down and tell you that how much I loved it. It's the best book about Lincoln I've ever read." And he just wanted, for 10 minutes, he just wanted to talk about Lincoln. I said, "He just wanted to talk about Lincoln." So that was a real surprise and treat, and very, very, very just sweet of him to reach out. But so far so good as far as Lincoln aficionados.
Yeah, I'm also interested in that, because obviously I don't know if some people think it's sort of blasphemous or whatever.
Yeah.
Interject your own sort of imagination. Just for everyone, just as John and I actually spoke before this, so we had a nice little chat, but just so everyone understands, and from reading through the book, it's mostly based in the historical record, and then John sometimes has sort of an imagination or his own kind of inference about maybe some of the other details in the room or in the environment around him that are not necessarily included in some of the materials. So John is kind of filling in the gaps a little bit with the sort of things that make a novel or story interesting. And I'm just wondering if some of the sort of the hardcore history department people say, "I don't like this," or something.
Yeah. Well, they haven't voiced that to me. Now, people are usually polite, and they're not going to tell you to your face, this stinks. But so far so good. I think in the world of Lincoln, that even great Lincoln historians, they want people to know about Lincoln, And I think in general, anything that interests people in Lincoln, and they're for it. And there's some people that won't read a nonfiction biography, but they will read a novel. They're fiction people, and this is one way to reach those people. Now, there's some people who just don't like historical fiction in general, because there always is that tension. When you're reading historical fiction, the reader does wonder, did this really happen? And I tell people, I tracked Lincoln's life as closely as I could. I had to make compromises. I mean, I had to leave a lot of stuff out, and I had to simplify some stuff, but I tracked it as closely as I could. But I tell people, though, if you're writing a paper or want to give a speech and quote Lincoln, don't quote him from this book without checking it out, because sometimes it's Lincoln's real words, but sometimes I've kind of I've rephrased it, or I've imagined what Lincoln would say. So it is historical fiction, and that's just the compromise. And it's that you have to be willing to accept that. But the advantage is that historical fiction can bring characters alive in ways that nonfiction simply can't, and we all know that. And that's my aim here, is to really try to make Lincoln a walking, talking, breathing fellow that you feel like you really have walked alongside him. And that's one of the primary aims, and I hope I've done that.
I think you have. And I wasn't going to mention this in closing, but since you mentioned Mike Pence kind of reading the book at that sort of point in time, what do you think, if we're going to look to Lincoln? And I know politicians of all stripes like to invoke Lincoln. He's someone we like to invoke. I will admit, I thought it was very funny when, during the presidential debate, I guess Donald Trump says to Hillary Clinton, "You're comparing yourself to Honest Abe." And everybody likes to invoke Lincoln. So if we had to pick a takeaway from Lincoln, whether it's perseverance, whether it's faith, what do you think is something that we can draw from him for our times today?
I think, since we are living maybe in perhaps the most divided and partisan times since the Civil War, possibly.
Does it give the Civil War a run for its money, sort of the lead up to the Civil War, or do you think the Civil War is sort of definitely, the time before, definitely worse than now in terms of division?
I think, you mean which of the two, the lead up or the? Yeah, I mean, I think that period was more divided than today.
So it was more divided than today.
Yeah, I think so.
That's good.
I think so. I think so.
Good.
But I hope so. But I think, Lincoln really was all about the Union, and he truly was. He wanted to bring the country back together. He, even all the way through the war, he refused to recognize that the South was anything but part of the country. He referred to Southerners in terms like my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, kind of understatements like that.
Yeah.
And in his first inaugural address, he said, "Passions may have strained, but must not break the bonds of our affection." He said, "We must not be enemies; we are friends." And then in his second inaugural address, with those famous words, he said, he wanted Americans to treat each other with malice toward none, with charity toward all, and spoke of healing. I think since everybody always wants a piece of Lincoln, the one thing we can always, I think, take from him is that we are all Americans, and what makes us all Americans are those great principles in the Declaration of Independence, to come back to what you led with.
Great way to end it,
His
John.
favorite, those, right. Lincoln knew that's what makes us one family, is those great shining principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence that we're always aiming for. We never get there maybe perfectly, but we're always aiming for. And that's I think the takeaway from him.
So, John Cribb, thank you for joining me once again, the author of Old Abe and the Rail Splitter. So thank you so much for what I think has been a really interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I enjoyed it.